Well, we know that in addition to storing food and water on top of Masada, that Herod also stored an arsenal of weapons. We do know also that Herod, of course, had soldiers stationed on top of the mountain, and in fact, after he died, the mountain continued to be occupied by a small garrison of soldiers.
Even the family palace of Herodium is deceptive, for it too is in fact a fortress, another place born of deep insecurity. The steep sides meant Herod could defend it with just a few soldiers. Precisely how was revealed when archaeologists found these huge stones at its base.
The big stone, we call them rolling stones, nothing to do with pop music. We call them rolling stones, and this is if a group of soldiers would try to go as a group up, or few ones, you roll them from top, and then it's very frightening as well as effective if it hits the people.
Herod's fear was so strong that he built more than 20 fortresses across his kingdom. Signals could be sent between the fortresses with mirrors.
They mirror the architecture of his paranoid mind. He had these deep fears of being attacked, of being vanquished, of having his titles taken from him. And the buildings speak to that fear quite directly.
Perhaps Herod felt so threatened that he would even kill the children of Bethlehem to protect his interests. But what was he so afraid of? Documents from the period reveal a widespread desire among Jews for a different kind of king. They believed a great leader, a Messiah, would be chosen by God to overthrow Herod and become the true king of the Jews. Biblical historian Warren Carter has studied the expectations of the times. In Herod's day, everyone knew the scriptures and their prophecies.
We do know that in some Jewish traditions during the time of Herod, there was some expectations among some people of a Messiah. We have some psalms written in the name of Solomon that look for a king in the line of David who will come to Jerusalem and without using military means will somehow expel the Romans. Herod was aware of these expectations and was aware of the threat that they posed.
The Jews had every reason to question Herod's claim to be their legitimate king. They expected their king to be a full-blooded Jew, and many were suspicious of Herod's Jewish origins.
Herod's Jewishness comes from the conversion of his grandfather. Herod thus is a third-generation Jew, and he acquires his commitment to Judaism as a result of that conversion process rather than through bloodline. Herod himself did not have a drop of Jewish blood in him, though he was Jewish by religion.
In fact, Josephus wrote that much of the population looked down on Herod, especially those from old families. This is why Herod married Princess Mariamne. As a member of the Jewish royal family, she strengthened his claim to the title King of the Jews. Fear of his subjects explains why Herod built such an unusual network of fortresses across his kingdom.
Herod fortified Masada and other palaces as a sort of a fortification system against an internal threat, his Jewish population, because the Jewish population did not like him, did not accept him as a legitimate king, and he lived his life in fear that one day they would rise up in revolt and try to kill him.
Herod was clearly worried. There's evidence that he went out of his way to flatter his Jewish subjects. He worked hard to gain popularity and public approval. This is the Western Wall, one of the oldest landmarks in Jerusalem. Jews from all over the world come here to pray. This wall is all that's left of a spectacular building masterminded by Herod. Precise descriptions by Josephus have allowed architects to recreate the entire building. It is the Temple of Jerusalem, and it was Herod's idea. The temple was hailed by many at the time as the most beautiful building in the world. It was a very public attempt by Herod to win the hearts and minds of the Jewish people.
Now, because there could only be in Judaism one temple building, the one in Jerusalem, therefore, by definition, that was, of course, a very important building because the entire Jewish religion was centered around that single building. We do know that it was a very large and magnificent building with marble and gold, and that it was surrounded by its own courtyard with towers and fortification walls.
$18,000 workers were employed, and more money was lavished on the temple than on any other building in the history of Judea.
We're told in one of the Jewish sources that God so favored this project that it only rained at night during the years of the building of the temple, but every day was a sunny, dry day so that the project could proceed unhindered.
During the construction work, Herod took great care to show respect for Jewish sensibilities.
On the human front, it was important that the temple not be defiled during the time of the rebuilding. And in order to get around that, Herod had priests trained in all the relevant building technologies as masons, as carpenters, and so on. There's no question that Herod rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem in order to solidify his reputation with the Jewish people.
With such public devotion to the Jewish faith, Herod should have won the approval of his people. But despite everything he tried, Josephus says that many still despised him. The roots of this hatred are not hard to trace. Although Herod was king of the Jews, he had been appointed by an occupying power, the Romans. And to make things worse, he pandered to them at every opportunity. In his next building project, Herod took a step that caused great offense to the Jewish population and swept away any remaining traces of goodwill. Herod's new project lies 60 miles northwest of Jerusalem and was once known as the Jewel of the Mediterranean. It is an entire city and seaport. This aqueduct, which supplied fresh water, is one of the best preserved structures. But in naming the city, Herod delivered the highest insult to his Jewish population. He named it Caesarea, in honor of the Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus. Its amphitheaters and arenas were packed with Roman entertainments despised by Jews as decadent and immoral.
Herod's hippodrome in Caesarea was for horse races, perhaps chariot races, but also could be used for gladiatorial games, battles with animals, between humans, those kinds of bloody spectacles. This was the bloody underside of Roman civilization.
Then Herod committed the unforgivable. He built a temple, not to the god of the Jews, but to a Roman god, the emperor. He even funded a vast harbor with proceeds from Jewish taxes. Little of it survives today, but from the air it's still possible to make out the foundations of this sophisticated piece of engineering. Architect Christopher Brandon has been carrying out underwater archaeology that is revealing the true scale of Herod's harbor.
What you first see is basically a reef. You think it's just a natural reef. And then you start to see beam impressions, post holes, and you start to realize that this is not a natural feature. This is a man-made structure.
Herod used a revolutionary building technique that had just been invented by the Romans.
Herod constructed this harbor by floating out wooden boxes which were sunk in a line by filling them with concrete. All it was is an enclosing wall which was always filled with water. So the concrete was poured into the water and set within the water. They formed a solid foundation on which he could then build the rest of the piers that actually formed the harbor itself.
In the final analysis, Herod's sympathies lay with the Romans. No wonder Jews challenged the legitimacy of his kingship. No wonder he felt insecure. It would certainly give him a motive for murdering the children of Bethlehem. But was Herod actually capable of such a barbaric crime? The first indication of just how far he would go came when he was 38 years old. In 35 BC, Herod appointed a new high priest at the temple in Jerusalem. The high priest was second in power only to the king. Under pressure from his wife Mariamne and from her mother, Herod appointed his brother-in-law, the 17-year-old Aristobulus. But Herod worried that powerful Jewish families might form an alliance against him and back Aristobulus, a full-blooded Jew, as king. Then, at a party at Herod's palace, Aristobulus was mysteriously drowned. Few believed that it was an accident, and Josephus was convinced that Herod had had the young man drowned.